Hello everybody and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. I've got some spook for you today. Now, there's nothing that sets the scene for a spooky experience more than an abandoned lighthouse. It conjures up tales of yesteryear on lonely isolated rocks set amongst the rolling tides. The setting itself leaves nothing to the imagination as we see that dim light shining through thick fog as the waves lash against the hull of your vessel or on the island's rocks as you wonder if you'll make it safely ashore. It's not just the elements that mariners have to worry about, and they're not inside the lighthouse. It's the keepers who have fear in there. He said that many of them lost their minds just to the sheer isolation alone. And if we dig a little deeper, we realise there have been many strange cases where keepers or their family members have suddenly vanished overnight or died in mysterious tragic circumstances. Each case more puzzling than the last. Our first case is she was eaten by rats. Flatholm Lighthouse, Bristol. Now, Flatholm itself has been inhabited since at least the Bronze Age. The notorious tide of the British Channel has hurled many ships against the island's rocky coast, and much of the island's past has been marred by tragedy and death. For example, in December 1790, the lighthouse keepers on duty had a miraculous escape when their tower was hit by lightning during a violent storm. They managed to avoid injury, but a 10-foot crack was blasted into the side of the tower. Proof of the dangers of the profession. Add to that the responsibility for guiding any passing ship to safety. In 1870, the British sloop known as the William and Mary was scuppered after hitting rocks in rough seas. The ship's mate and two other sailors escaped in the only lifeboat, leaving behind 54 other passengers who sadly drowned. 50 of the recovered bodies are buried on Flatholm Island, and in the late 19th century, sailors arriving into Cardiff with cholera were confined at Quarantine Hospital on the island. The last patient to die in the hospital died of bubonic plague, believe it or not, known as the Black Death back then. Now, the hospital lies derelict and crumbling, a solitary testament to the last lonely days of these sailors' lives. And then it gets even creepier. A lighthouse keeper is said to have died at Flatholm, leaving his wife alone on the island. She carried on keeping the light going by hauling the coal up the stairs to keep the brazier lit. However, after a light had not been seen for a few days by passing ships, some of the worried boatmen landed on the island to discover the dead body of the wife, which had been ravaged by rats. Her body was hung high from the lighthouse to stop the rats getting to her, and the men set off to the mainland to raise the alarm. But later, when they returned to collect her, she'd completely vanished. There was no trace of her remains anywhere, and an in-depth search was carried out. It's said that today, the ghost of the woman still walks around the island, and when it's quiet and the wind is still, you can hear her crying out in pain for her husband. The mystery of how her body vanished was never solved, and the case has vanished into the folds of time. Rats that jump ship have been a problem in the past, often taking over Lighthouse Island. One lighthouse keeper said seeing hundreds of pair of eyes watching him as he walked around at night was awful. In fact, killing rats had become sport for many of the keepers. Oh, can you imagine all the scurrying little bodies as you're walking around a dark island at night? Now, wardens and volunteers over the years have encountered a fair few unexplained occurrences on the island, ranging from the sounds of footsteps walking in a deserted building, the disappearance of tools, and the feeling of a presence in certain rooms are reported, which is understandable when you realise just how many untimely deaths are associated with Flatholm. on the island itself or out in the sea. Now, it would be remiss of me to feature our spooky UK lighthouse tales without including the one with the biggest mystery of all, and that's the one from the Flannan Islands where all of the keepers vanish overnight. The disappearance of the Eilean lighthouse keepers. Now, Flannan Island is named after Saint Flannan, a 16th century Irish bishop who later became a saint. He built a chapel on the island, and for centuries, shepherds used to bring their sheep over to the island to graze, but they refused to stay beyond dusk as the night drew in, fearful of the spirits believed to haunt the remote spot. The Flannan Islands, where this case takes place, are situated in the remote Outer Hebrides. The lighthouse at Eilean was uninhabited, as was the island, but the reports of strange experiences there predate the disappearance of the keepers. It was the transatlantic steamer Arctur that first noticed something was wrong on its voyage to the port of Leith from Philadelphia. The Arctur passed the lighthouse on Flannan Island on the night of the 15th of December 1900, and the crew saw that the light was off. After docking in Leith 3 days later, the news was passed on to the Northern Lighthouse Board that something was amiss on Flannan. Captain James Harvey was in charge of a ship which was also carrying Joseph Moore, a replacement lighthouse keeper, and to return one of the other current keepers. As the ship reached the landing platform, Captain Harvey was surprised to see no one waiting for them, as would happen usually. He blew his horn to alert the men and sent up a warning flare to attract their attention. There was no response, just an eerie silence and the lapping of waves. Joseph Moore climbed into the small boat, then rowed ashore, climbed up the steep set of stairs that led up to the lighthouse. According to Moore himself, the replacement lighthouse keeper suffered an overwhelming sense of dread on his long walk up to the top of the cliffs. He said it was a feeling he couldn't shake. When Joseph Moore reached the lighthouse, he knew something was immediately wrong, as the door to the lighthouse was unlocked and open, and in the entrance hall, 2 of the 3 oilskin coats were missing, suggesting 2 men were on the island, leaving 1 man to manage the lighthouse. Joseph Moore decided to search the lighthouse and went into the kitchen area, where he found half-eaten food and an overturned chair, almost as if someone had jumped from their seat in a hurry. To add to this peculiar scene, the kitchen clock had stopped, and a canary in a cage was the only signs of life. Moore continued to search the rest of the lighthouse, but no sign of the lighthouse keepers was found. He ran back to the ship to inform Captain Harvey, who subsequently ordered a search of the islands for the missing men. No one was found. Harvey quickly sent back a telegram to the mainland, which in turn was forwarded to the Northern Lighthouse Board headquarters in Edinburgh, and the telegraph read, "A dreadful accident has happened at Flannan's. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. On our arrival there, the afternoon, there was no signs of life. There was nothing out there, nothing to be seen. Having fired a rocket, but as no response was made, and managed to land more, we went up to the station, but found no keepers there. The clocks were stopped, and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. Night was coming on. We couldn't wait to make something as to their fate. We had to leave. I left Moore, MacDonald, Boyaster, and 2 seamen on the island to keep the light burning until you make other arrangements. Will not return to Oban until I hear from you. I've repeated this wire to Moorhead in case you're not at home. I will remain at the telegraph office tonight until it closes, if you wish to wire me." A few days later, Robert Moorhead, the board superintendent, who both recruited and knew all 3 of the men personally, departed for the island to investigate the disappearance for himself. His investigation of the lighthouse found nothing different as to what Moore had already reported. That is, except for the lighthouse log. Muirhead immediately noticed that the last few days of entries were unusual. On the 12th of December, Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, wrote of severe winds that the likes of which had never been seen before in 20 years. He also noticed that James Ducat, the principal keeper, had been very quiet, and the third assistant, William MacArthur, had been crying. Now, there is some debate about these notes. Not everybody believes that they were found by Moorhead. They think they might have been added into the story later. I don't know. I can't answer that. It's strange, because the final remark was that William MacArthur, who was a seasoned mariner and was known on the Scottish mainland as a tough brawler, was crying about a storm or a big wind. It doesn't make sense. The log entries on the 13th of December stated that the storm was still raging and that all three men had been praying. But why would three experienced lighthouse keepers, safely situated on a brand new lighthouse that was 150 feet above the sea level, be praying for a storm to stop? They should have been perfectly safe. Even more peculiar is that there were no reported storms in the area on the 12th, 13th or 14th of December. In fact, the weather was calm, and the storms that were to batter the island didn't hit until December the 17th. The final log entry was made on the 15th of December, and it simply read, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." What was meant by God is over all? After reading the logs, Moorhead attention turned to the remaining oil-skinned coat that had been left in the entrance hall. Why, in the bitter cold winter, with supposed storms, had one of the lighthouse keepers gone outside without his coat? Even more worrying, why had all three lighthouse staff left their posts at the same time, when rules and regulations strictly forbid that? One man has to stay behind at all times to keep the light going. Further clues were found down by the landing platform, where there was plenty of evidence that the island had recently been hit by a massive storm. A supply box had been smashed open and its contents strewn across the ground, despite being 100 feet above sea level. Iron railings on the side of a path had been bent and twisted out of shape. Part of a railway track had been torn from its concrete moorings, and a huge rock weighing more than a ton had been displaced. Turf had been ripped up from the top of the cliffs, which are 200 feet above sea level. There was no sign of the three keepers anywhere. Most people presume the poor fellows must have been blown over the cliffs, or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. But if so, why had none of the bodies been washed ashore? Why had one of the men left the lighthouse without taking his coat? Especially since this was December in the house at the Hebrides, and they said it was a terrible storm. Why had three experienced lighthouse keepers been taken unaware by a wave? And although these were all good questions, the most pertinent and persistent question was around the weather conditions at the time. The sea should have been calm. They were sure of this, as the lighthouse could be seen from the nearby island of Lewis, and had any bad weather been happening, it would have obscured the lighthouse from view. Speculation was soon rife, and theories were soon doing the rounds, saying the men had been gobbled up by a giant sea serpent, or whisked away by a huge seabird. One theory had the men leave the island by boat to escape debts, while another had them spirited away by the skeleton crew of a ghost ship. Some people even thought the men had been kidnapped by foreign spies or aliens. Now, over the following decades, subsequent lighthouse keepers at Lillimore have reported strange voices in the wind, calling out the names of the three dead men. Theories about their disappearances have ranged from foreign invaders capturing the men like I say, all the way through to alien abduction. Whatever the reason for their disappearance, something or someone snatched those three men from the rock at Illamore on Winter's Day over 100 years ago. One of the keepers, William MacArthur, was by all accounts an ill-tempered man who was quick to settle an argument with his fists. Now, it's been speculated that he could have started a fight up on the western landing, which led to all three men falling to their deaths from the cliff. Or, as many people think, he killed his two fellow keepers in a fit of rage, threw them in the sea, and in remorse took the same fate in his grief. I would like to interject at this point that we have no real evidence to fit any theory in this case, as it's impossible now to go back there and solve it. There have been many cases through the years of lighthouse keepers being so isolated, it's affected their mind, and many of them have resorted to violence or self-harm, due to mental strain. It must be incredibly hard to stay out there, for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. With just either your own company or, a couple of men for company. Kind of like cabin fever, I suppose. What happens if you don't get along? Now, the Smalls Lighthouse tragedy is a strange one. It's quite sad. And the incident greatly impacted how lighthouses worked around the British Isles. The scene is like something from a horror film, one that depicts a dark and lonely existence for one man who suffered in isolation with nothing for company but the corpse of his dead colleague. We travel back to 1801. Thomas Griffin and Thomas Howell worked at the Smalls Lighthouse that sits 20 miles off the Pembrokeshire coast. The lighthouse was built in 1776 on the Smalls Rocks, and by all accounts, the two men hated each other. They often argued and fought, and people knew of the animosity between them. It was not an amicable setup, to say the least, and they were alone together, 20 miles out at sea. So Howell ran into a problem when Griffin was in a freak accident and became unwell. He had no means of calling for help due to the pair's remote location and the battering storms. And weeks later, Griffith finally died. Panic gripped Howell. What should he do? He didn't want to bury the body at sea, since people would no doubt accuse him of murdering Griffin because of their past history. At first, he tried to keep the body in the lighthouse. With no means to preserve the corpse, it began to decompose. The smell would have been overwhelming. Howell next built a coffin and tied it to the rocks. He placed Griffin in the coffin and continued to man the lighthouse on his own. But the waves battered the coffin on the rocks, breaking it open. Griffin's arm seemed to wave to Howell with the movement of the sea. Most people think Howell spent 3 weeks alone at the lighthouse with just a corpse for company. The isolation and what happened badly traumatised him, leaving him almost unrecognisable by the time his replacements relieved him. The tragedy did not end with Griffith's death. Stories are told of how, one night, the wind that blew apart the coffin led the recently departed man's arm to catch the wind in such a manner that it was visible to Howell inside the hut. One can only imagine his mental state. The only thing more frightening than being completely alone is being completely alone with a corpse that belonged to your former colleague, that's now beckoning you from beyond the grave. There are even tales of ship's crews sailing past the lighthouse during the day and seeing this arm, draped from a hurriedly made and wind-torn box, waving at them. Unable to make out what it was, they went about the journey and appreciated the glow that the lighthouse continued to emit. After weeks of storms and nightmares, the weather improved and a boat from Milford was able to reach the Smalls. Once there, they found Griffith, a dead man, and Howell, a broken man. The boat took Howells back to the Pembrokeshire shore, but he wasn't the same person that had left the coast just weeks earlier. He was grey, he was dishevelled, and he was empty. Upon Howell's return, he was so severely affected by what had happened out there that people, even those close to him, didn't recognise him. As with all the tragedies, light must be taken from lessons learned. And in this case, the incident at the Smalls changed history, and it became significant in the fact that any British maritime lighthouse must have a minimum of 3 keepers at all times. Now, I cannot state that I know what that must have been like for him, not only having to live with the corpse of your dead colleague, but to see it waving at you from the rocky shore must have been absolutely mind bending. Now, sometimes even the makers of the lighthouses go crazy, and the ghost stories of Eddystone Lighthouse in Devon are based around that. 13 miles south of Plymouth, on a jagged reef in the open sea, stands one of the most famous lighthouses in the world, Eddystone Lighthouse, and it's existed in various forms since the late 17th century. It guided ships past some deadly rocks out there. 4 different towers have stood on the reef, each with its own tragedy, and from those tragedies come the tales of the haunting. Sailors and lighthouse keepers alike have spoken of strange shadows, bad omens, and ghostly presences around Eddystone. Some say the spirits of its lost builders and keepers still linger in the spray. The first lighthouse, built by Henry Winstanley in 1698, was an ornate wooden structure unlike anything else in Britain. But in 1703, the Great Storm, one of the fiercest in England, destroyed it completely. Winstanley himself was inside at the time when he died along with his creation. Later versions fared little better. One burned down in 1755 after a fire in the lantern. Another keeper, said to have been unstable, died in mysterious circumstances on the reef. The third tower, built of stone by John Smeaton, survived longer but was eventually dismantled. Its base is still visible today beside the modern structure. The current lighthouse was built in 1882 and it's still in use, but the legends of its predecessors continue to haunt the Eddystone rocks. Stories around Eddystone often centre on the first builder, Henry Winstanley. Sailors claimed that in fierce storms, a shadow could be seen amid the waves, standing where the old wooden tower once rose, of a man gazing defiantly out at the sea. Some took this to be Winstanley himself, still guarding his doomed creation. Others speak of bad luck and omens. Fishermen said that if strange lights danced above the reef in rough weather, seeing them meant certain death for a sailor before the year was out. Keepers complained of eerie feelings in the tower, as though unseen eyes were watching them during the long nights. A story from the 18th century tells of a keeper who grew increasingly disturbed, ranting that voices in the wind were calling him to the sea. Not long after, he died suddenly in the lantern room, and his ghost was said to roam the towers, a warning of the madness that isolation can bring. Now, like most haunted lighthouses, Eddystone cannot be reached on foot as it sits 13 miles offshore. It can only be viewed from a boat trip from Plymouth Hoe, where telescopes, give you that distance glimpse. For centuries, sailors returning home to Plymouth would look out for its lights, and some claimed to see more than just the lamp shining in the darkness. Standing on the Hoe at dusk, looking out to where the reef breaks the sea, it's easy to see how legends grew around this lonely outpost. Few places in England combine such isolation, history, and tragedy. Eddystone Lighthouse is a triumph of engineering against the sea, but also the graveyard of many. From Winstanley's death in the Great Storm to the whispered tales of keepers driven to despair, the reef has soaked up centuries of human struggle. Perhaps those who died here never left. Maybe their ghosts still drift in the spray, watching as the waves crash against a tower they could not outlast. The sea calls us humans, It speaks to us, and we head there whenever we have the opportunity. In olden times, we set sail for new land. We'd look for other people, other tribes, other communities. But it's also always had that haunting Davy Jones locker type feeling. Because let's be honest, there's thousands of people that are dead below the sea. It is a literal graveyard. Now, the haunted lighthouse at Hut Head in Ireland is a sight to be seen. It is barren and majestic. It climbs above surrounding scenery, its eye trailing the landscape like a silent guardian looking out to sea. Hook Lighthouse is not only the oldest operational lighthouse in the world, but also one of the most fascinating examples of medieval architecture in Ireland. Built approximately 800 years ago, it stands as a testament to maritime history. The lighthouse tower, which has 4 stories, its walls are 4 metres thick and it's made of limestone. Now, Waterford Harbour has been a vital part of Ireland's maritime heritage for centuries. Interestingly, a Welsh monk founded a monastery close to the site of Foot Lighthouse in the 5th century. Monks tended to the lighthouse until 1641. Now, there are rumours that their remains are entombed within the walls of the lighthouse, but I'm not sure what the evidence for this is. Other folklore claims one monk lies within the walls. Charles II allowed the restoration of the lighthouse in 1665, and when builders enlarged it and extended it from 18 metres to 24 metres, and it's been in active use ever since. Keepers lived at the lighthouse until 1977, but then it went automatic in 96. Various paranormal researchers have ventured to the location in the hopes of discovering some unexplained activity. They have often found what they came looking for. The sensitive to the other side have claimed to feel a heavy atmosphere throughout the location. The cottages which stand beside the lighthouse have been of particular interest to anyone who's looking for paranormal activity, because many of the visitors there claim to feel a sense of suddenly not being alone. An eerie feeling kind of seeps throughout the place. It's also said that William Marshall himself haunts the lighthouse, keeping vigil in his tower. Psychics who visited the location have picked up on his presence numerous times. Tales of a phantom monk are also well known in the area, with various sightings of a man in a hooded garment that walks both backwards and forwards on the tower and at its base has been reported. Now, regardless of whether the monks were built into the walls of the lighthouse, I would imagine that as they died, their bodies were buried on the island or within the sea. And sometimes lighthouses are out there for more than just the living. Our next case features a ghostly hunchback, and it's just undescribable. Happisburgh Lighthouse, spelt Happisburgh but pronounced Happisburgh, has what's known as the Pump Hill Ghost, and it's a well-known spirit that haunts the village of Happisburgh, and it's said to be seen near the lighthouse. He is sometimes seen in the village carrying his severed head in his arms. Now, the headless spectre follows a route from the church towards the cliff, past the lighthouse, and along the coast to Cart Gap. The story goes that a group of smugglers fell into a drunken fight after spoils, and one man was brutally killed. His head was hacked off, and his legs were severed, his body stuffed into a sack, and he was dumped unceremoniously down a village well. Now, if I was a ghost, I wouldn't be happy at that either, and he is not. Not long after, people began to see a terrifying, hunched back figure staggering from the shore towards the village. He had no head, no legs, and he carried a heavy sack in his arms. The apparition would glide up the moonlight lane, stop at the well on Pump Hill, and disappear into it with a groan. One night, a brave soul set out to follow the ghost on its journey to see where it would travel to. Gingerly tracing the spectre's route, the man watched as the otherworldly creature lurched towards the village well, at which point it launched the sack it carried, and then itself, down into the well. The next day, the decision was taken to search said well. Villagers watched in trepidation as a slight young man was lowered in a bucket deep down into the dark well until he hit the bottom with a splash. Inside the sack was a pair of sailor's boots, and inside the boots was a pair of sailor's legs. And from then on, villagers claimed that whenever a storm was coming, groans would rise from the well, as if the murdered smuggler was warning of danger. Sometimes a ghostly shape is seen materialising in the dark and begins to walk towards you, along with the awful realisation that the figure drawing ever closer has no legs, and then the even more dreadful discovery that the creature's head is dangling down its back, attached only by a thin strip of flesh. The ghost path took him past the lighthouse, and at first the people thought the creature was humpbacked, until with horror they realised the hump was actually the torso's almost severed head, bouncing behind it as it made its way towards the triangle of land, a long plait hanging from its head, almost touching the ground. Even today, visitors are told the tale of the headless, legless spectre, forever tied to the coast where he met his end. Our next case takes us to the beautiful Whitley Bay and St Mary's Lighthouse, which is located on an island in the bay. It's connected to the mainland by a causeway. A medieval chapel was built on St Mary's Island, and next to it was a burial ground for monks. The remains of the chapel vanished from the lighthouse was built in 1898. Human remains have been found close to the lighthouse when the lighthouse keepers' cottages were built. Anthony Mitchell, a local customs officer, was brutally killed by smugglers in 1722, and they dumped his body on the island, which became known as Smuggler's Creek. On the 4th of September 1739, Michael Curry was executed in Newcastle for the murder of Robert Sheville, the landlord of the Three Horseshoes Inn at Hartley. Curry may have been the lover of the landlord's wife. His body was afterwards hung in chains from the gibbet on the spot, within sight of the scene of his crime. Ever since the gruesome event, this headland has been known as Curry's Point. St Mary's Lighthouse can be seen from the gibbet. Work began on the lighthouse in 1896, and it took 2 years to complete. It stands about 126 feet and rises like a magnificent monument on the headland. There's an eerie chill that's reported in the lighthouse when it's empty. 1799, Russian soldiers were quarantined on St Mary's Island after contacting cholera. A few of the soldiers survived, and those that died were buried there. It's also known that the monks were buried there from time of priory. Some visitors to St Mary's Lighthouse have reported feeling cold when climbing the lighthouse. Our next case takes us to the northeast of England, where the Souter Lighthouse. It was manned with an experienced lighthouse keeper when this tragedy happened. Souter was the first electric lighthouse, and it said that its glaring light could be seen for many miles and guided every vessel and sailor. While locals slept soundly, the isolated keeper monitored the huge light all hours of the night, while his family slept in the quarters close by. As the days and nights passed, the lighthouse keeper slowly began to change. His moods became erratic and bizarre. His behaviour began to get even stranger. Before long, The keeper was gnawing at his flesh, tearing handfuls of his hair from his scalp, and mercilessly pounding his face and head against the window of the watchtower. One evening, a fisherman witnessed these events and ran to investigate, thinking the keeper was being attacked. Upon inspection, it was clear that the keeper, and the keeper alone, was responsible. He was moved to a local asylum and certified insane. Paranormal activity at Souter Lighthouse has been reported by staff and visitors alike. One of the most frequently encountered spirits is that of the former lighthouse keeper, believed to be John James Bowen, who served at Souter in the early 1900s. Witnesses have described seeing a man in period clothing walking up the lighthouse stairs or standing at the top of the tower. People have reported shrill cries emanating from the lighthouse watchtower, and some have reported witnessing the transparent figure of a man mutilating himself before disappearing into the darkness. He is always described as wearing a blue peaked cap and a thick blue trench coat with chunky brass buttons fastened from the bottom right up to the collar. Now, this was a common uniform worn by lighthouse keepers in the 1800s, and he is said to have a long, drawn, pale face, wearing an expression of tiredness and grief. He makes no sound and only walks a few steps before disappearing silently into thin air. Many years ago, a man known as John would regularly visit the lighthouse. He could be seen sitting outside on the grass, staring aimlessly out to sea, and he would occasionally leave his grassy spot to wander the gravel paths around the lighthouse and the keeper's lodgings. The lighthouse grounds were a dedicated right of way for the general public with a museum inside, so nobody ever thought, to question the strange man. Those who saw the man would report darkness in his eyes, and an unusual energy seemed to penetrate the air whenever he was near. One staff member recalled walking past the man as she brushed shoulders with him. She felt a dark and evil presence engulf her, and all the hairs raised on the back of her neck and arms. When she looked at him, his eyes were as black as the night, and his grin was wide and evil. Eventually things took a sinister turn. One morning, the lighthouse keeper was conducting his rounds. Upon entering the engine room, he found the man dead. An investigation was launched. No foul play or suicide was determined. The reason for the man's death remains unknown. Even after an autopsy, no solid conclusion was passed. Many people are convinced that an evil presence that lurks in the lighthouse is responsible. The Flatholm building, adjacent to the lighthouse, is said to be haunted by the ghost of a young girl. Staff members are reporting hearing childlike laughter and the sound of running footsteps when no children are present. Some have even claimed to feel a small hand tugging at their clothing. In the lighthouse keeper's cottage, visitors have experienced sudden temperature drops and the sensation of being watched. Objects have reportedly moved on their own, and doors have been known to slam shut unexpectedly. The surrounding grounds are also said to be haunted. Witnesses have reported seeing shadowy figures moving across the cliffs at night, and some have heard disembodied voices calling out from the sea. This activity is often attributed to the spirit of sailors who perished in shipwrecks along the coast. So the next time you're near a lonely lighthouse, remember the folk that have been heading there for millennia from the sea and the land alike. So until next time, I'd like to say thank you for everybody that's tuned in tonight. It's been lovely to get with you guys again. And for anybody out there who's listening to the tales on a dark, stormy night, you never know. You might be the next person to have a really creepy encounter in the UK. But until then, I bid you all good night.